On the day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, he called the names of everyone in that room except mine. I sat in the last row and waited for the familiar name to be spoken, but it never appeared. My name is Emily Carter, 32 years old, a doctor living in New York who had been sending money back to my family for nearly 10 years without ever asking for anything in return. Instead, I received only a sealed envelope and $10,000 like a cold consolation prize, while my younger brother inherited tens of millions and the beachfront house my grandfather had once promised to leave to me. When I opened the envelope, my heart seemed to fall because inside was a copy of a birth certificate showing that I was not the biological daughter of the man who had raised me for 32 years, and that was the moment I understood that my family had been hiding a secret far bigger than anything I had ever suspected. If it were you, what would you do when you discovered this truth? Would you stay silent to keep a family that was already cracked together, or would you say everything, even knowing it could destroy everything? Comment A if you choose silence, and B if you choose to tell the truth, because my decision changed the fate of my entire family forever. Before that, I had always believed I was the eldest daughter in a normal family in California, even though I had never been loved as much as my younger brother. I still thought it was only a difference in how affection was expressed. Sitting in the lawyer's office that day, I felt like someone who had wandered into a meeting of a family I did not belong to. My mother avoided my eyes. My stepfather looked down at the table, and my younger brother sat up straight, as if he had already prepared himself to become the heir, while I held only a thin envelope in my hands and thousands of unanswered questions in my mind. I could not understand why my grandfather had left me this instead of property, and I understood even less why he chose to tell the truth through a piece of paper instead of with his own words while he was still alive. On the way out of the lawyer's office, I stood for a long time in the parking lot and looked at that envelope as if it were a door leading into a past I had never been allowed to enter. I knew that from that moment on, my life could never return to what it had been before, because no matter how long the truth is hidden, it will always find a way into the light, and I was the first person to see it. Before telling you the whole story behind that envelope, I just want to ask you once more. If it were you, would you choose to protect a family built on lies, or protect yourself with the truth? Leave your comment, because this story is not only mine, but also the story of many people who grew up in families full of secrets. After standing in the parking lot for a few more minutes, I did not go home but drove straight to the hospital where my grandfather had died that night, as if my body automatically went searching for answers to the envelope lying on the seat beside me. The road leading into the medical district in California, so familiar from childhood, suddenly felt long and heavy. Every turn made me feel as if I were leaving my old life behind and stepping into another life I had never prepared myself to face. The hospital hallway was still brightly lit, even though visiting hours were over. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the steady sound of stretcher wheels rolling across the tiled floor made me realize that the world was still moving normally, while inside me was an emptiness I could not name. Room 317, where my grandfather had spent his final days, had already been cleared. Only the white bed and the chair by the window remained. I stood for a long time at the doorway and did not dare to step inside, because I was afraid that if I saw that room, his last words would echo even more clearly in my mind. The image of him holding my hand late that night came back vividly, his eyes tired but still forcing themselves open to look at me as if trying to remember my face for the last time. And then he leaned close to my ear and whispered, in a broken voice, that I was not a Carter, that I should not believe everything I had heard, and that I should find my birth records before it was too late. At that time, I thought he was speaking in delirium because of medication and pain, but now, holding the copy of the birth certificate in my hands, I understood that it was the only final message he left for me. A nurse came and handed me his personal belongings, including an old watch, a pair of reading glasses, and a small brown notebook. She said these were the last things he had kept with him, and when I opened the notebook, I saw lines of dates and several unfamiliar names. Among them, my name was circled many times, as if he had hesitated for a long time before writing it. I carried the notebook and sat down on a chair in the hallway, reading the messy handwriting again and again, and trying to understand why he had written those names, and why my name was marked differently from the rest of the family. When my mother and stepfather came out from the office handling the paperwork, I asked them what he had said before he died. My mother answered that he told everyone not to argue about money and to take good care of the funeral. Her voice avoided my eyes as if she were afraid I might see something there. I asked about the words he had said to me, but she shook her head and told me not to make a big deal while the family was in chaos, and that avoidance made my heart grow cold little by little. My stepfather said nothing and only stood up to take a phone call in the hallway, while my younger brother looked at me with irritation as if I were disturbing the fragile peace of the family. I realized that none of them were willing to tell me the truth, and none of them wanted to hear what I had discovered from the will envelope. That night I did not go home, but sat alone in my car in the hospital parking lot, watching the emergency room lights stay on all night, and wondering who I really was in this family for the past 32 years. Small memories suddenly returned like scattered pieces. The times relatives said I did not look like anyone in the family, the family dinners where I always sat at the end of the table, and the times I sent money to help, but only received a brief, "thank you." All of it suddenly made sense in a painful way. I understood that if my grandfather had given up his silence to tell me the truth in his final moments, then I could not pretend I had never heard it. And if that copy of the birth certificate existed, then somewhere in this hospital, there must still be the original record of the day I was born. That thought kept me from returning to New York immediately, because from that moment I was no longer just a daughter excluded from a will but someone standing before the door of a past that had been hidden for more than 3 decades. When I started the car and left the parking lot in the night, I knew that staying in California for a few more days to search for my birth records would take me farther than I expected, but I also knew that if I did not do it, I would have to live my whole life with the question of where I truly belonged, and that very question led me back to the hospital the next morning to begin the search for the truth about myself. The next morning I returned to St. Mary Hospital with the feeling that I was walking backward into the day I was born. The old building standing between 2 major roads, with its faded yellow walls, made me feel that it was not just a hospital, but a place that stored a part of the past. My family had deliberately locked away for more than 30 years. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the scent of old paper in the air made me nauseous. My heart beat so fast that every step felt like moving closer to a truth I both feared and longed to see. At the reception desk, the young clerk typed my name into the computer and shook her head, saying that the electronic system no longer kept birth data from those years and that I would need to go to the paper archive in the basement if I wanted more detailed information. I sat waiting in a narrow room, lit by pale yellow light shining on old plastic chairs, looking out at the parking lot where strangers passed by without knowing that I was about to read the story of my own birth. The archive supervisor was an elderly woman named Margaret, her gray hair neatly tied behind her head and her hands trembling slightly as she held a large set of keys and opened each metal door. When I gave her the copy of my birth certificate and said I wanted to see the original record of the day I was born, she looked at me for a long time with the eyes of someone who had just encountered a familiar name after many years, then slowly nodded and led me down a long hallway where rows of metal cabinets stood like coffins of memory. The sound of metal scraping echoed dryly as she pulled out a drawer and placed a thin, dusty file on the table. I saw my name written in blue ink at the top corner, but beside it were lines crossed out with another color of ink, as if someone had tried to erase one truth and replace it with another story. I turned each page, feeling as though I were reading the life of a stranger. The date and time of birth matched, but the father's name was not the man who had raised me for 32 years. And when I turned to the next page, my hand froze because I saw another record with the same date and the same time, only minutes apart. 2 newborn names lay side by side like 2 parallel lines broken apart. 1 baby boy recorded as my mother's child, and 1 baby girl recorded as the child of a woman with no clear address. I asked Margaret whether there could have been a mistake. She remained silent for a long time and then said that some mistakes did not come from error but from human decisions made to save a family or to hide a greater mistake. Her words made my spine go cold, because I understood that this was not an administrative accident but a deliberate arrangement. I took out my grandfather's notebook and opened to the page with the wave symbol and the repeated initials. Margaret looked and said softly that the symbol had once been used in the hospital to mark special birth cases that needed separate tracking because they involved legal or identity issues of the child. In that moment, I understood that my grandfather had been the only one in the family who knew the truth from the beginning and had carried it with him his entire life. not because he wanted to deceive me, but because he feared that if the truth were spoken, not just one person, but the entire family would collapse. I left the archive with copies of the records in my bag, and the feeling that I had shed an old layer of skin. The sky outside was still blue, as if nothing had happened, but inside me was a silent storm. I drove through the familiar streets of my childhood, and suddenly remembered every moment I had been treated differently. The times my mother avoided my questions about my birth, the way my stepfather's eyes always lingered on me longer than usual, as if looking at someone who did not belong, and now all those pieces began to arrange themselves into a clearer picture than ever before. I no longer saw myself as just a daughter who had not been loved enough, but as a child who had been placed into a life that was not hers from the very first day she opened her eyes. That night I sat alone in the living room and read my grandfather's notebook from beginning to end. The short lines spoke of responsibility, of keeping silent to protect a family, of fear that, if the truth came out, 2 children would have to pay for the mistakes of adults. And I realized that the envelope in the will was not a punishment, but his final apology to me for letting me live in an identity that was not mine. I felt both angry and sorry for my mother. Angry because she chose to lie, but also sorry because she had probably lived more than 30 years in fear of being exposed. Every family meal and every group photograph had been another moment. She had to play the role of a mother to a child who was not her own. I looked at the family photo on the wall, and for the first time, it looked like a painting painted over many times to hide the original colors. Beautiful, but not true. Near dawn, I sat by the window and thought about my life in New York, about the patients I had told that truth was the foundation of all healing, and I understood that I could not continue to live in a family built on lies and call it peace. The decision came to me quietly but clearly that I had to face my mother and ask her for the whole truth, not to accuse her but to know why she had chosen that path and why she had let my grandfather carry this secret to the end of his life. When the sun rose, I held the records and the notebook in my hands, knowing that from that moment I was no longer a woman living in doubt, but someone about to enter the most difficult conversation of her life, because only when the truth was spoken could I know who I truly was and where my life had really begun. I walked into the kitchen, where my mother was washing dishes like every other morning. Sunlight came through the window and revealed the wrinkles on her face that I had never really looked at closely before. I placed the stack of records and my grandfather's notebook on the table without saying a word and just looked at her until she turned around and realized that my eyes were no longer the same as usual. She asked me what was wrong, but her voice trembled slightly as if she already knew what was coming. I told her that I had gone to St. Mary Hospital and had seen my birth records. Those words fell into the quiet kitchen like a heavy object. My mother stood still for a few seconds, and then turned her back, gripping the edge of the sink with both hands as if to keep herself from falling. I asked her directly if I was really her biological daughter, and why the birth certificate carried another woman's name. She kept shaking her head and said I had misunderstood, that old records often had mistakes, but when I opened my grandfather's notebook to the page with the wave symbol and placed it in front of her, her shoulders slowly collapsed, as if she no longer had the strength to keep the secret. She sat down, covered her face with both hands, and sighed for a long time before beginning to speak in a broken voice that year she had given birth to a weak baby boy who had to be taken into intensive care, and in the next room there was a baby girl who had been abandoned because her mother could not afford to raise her. In panic and fear of being looked down on by her husband's family, she agreed to a silent arrangement to exchange the identities of the 2 children. I could not believe what I was hearing. I asked who I really was and who the other child was. My mother said that I was the abandoned baby and my younger brother was her biological son, but from that moment on she decided to raise both of us as her own and never speak the truth. I asked about my stepfather and my grandfather. She admitted that they both knew. My stepfather accepted it because he needed a complete family image in front of relatives, and my grandfather opposed it but finally chose silence because he feared that if the truth came out, the whole family would fall apart. Every word she spoke cut deeply into my memories. All the times I had been treated differently, the distant looks from my stepfather, the moments when my grandfather stared at me for a long time and then turned away. Now, all of it had a clear explanation. She said she never thought I would find out and believed that silence was the best way to protect both children, that if the truth came out I would lose my family and my brother would lose his identity, and she did not have the courage to choose who should suffer. I asked her what about me and what about my right to know who I was. She burst into tears and said she had loved me like her own child and never meant to hurt me, that she only wanted me to have a stable life in a complete family. Hearing that, I did not know whether to feel angry or to feel pity, because I had been deceived for 32 years and yet raised by a love built on fear. I told her that my grandfather had left clues for me because he did not want to take this secret to his grave. She was silent for a long time and then said that maybe that was his way of making up for not being brave enough to speak while he was alive. The kitchen felt heavy, like a sealed room with no air. I looked at my mother and saw a woman who had lived her whole life with a lie that had slowly become her truth. I asked why she had never told me even a little. She said she was more afraid of losing me than anything else, and that if I knew the truth I would leave. And that sentence made me understand that all these years she had raised me with the fear of being abandoned. I stood up and said I needed time to understand everything, that I could not forgive or accept it immediately, but I also could not pretend I had never heard what she just said. She looked at me with pleading eyes and asked if I would tell my brother. I did not answer, and only said that I needed to decide my own path. When I walked out of the kitchen, I heard her say behind me that no matter who I was, she still saw me as her daughter. Her words echoed in the empty space, like a late attempt to hold me back. I went up to my room and closed the door. What I felt was not an explosion of anger but a growing emptiness. I knew that from that moment our mother and daughter relationship would never be the same again, because between us now existed a truth that could not be erased. And that truth would force me to step out of the role my family had written for me from the day I was born. That night I could not sleep. My mother's words kept repeating in my head like an old tape stuck on replay. I stared at the ceiling and wondered whose life I had been living for 32 years. My mother's daughter, or the abandoned child no one wanted. The next morning I drove to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. The familiar road felt longer than usual. The rows of trees passed by like memories whose meaning I had never fully understood. I stood in front of his grave for a long time, reading his name and the dates of his birth and death as if searching for a final answer from someone who had been silent his whole life. I placed his notebook in front of the grave and said that I understood why he had left signs for me. Because he could not speak the truth while alive, so he left it for me to find myself. The wind gently moved the dry leaves at my feet, and I realized that if he had not left clues, I might have lived in a false story for the rest of my life, and that made me both grateful and heartbroken. I remembered the times he looked at me with sad but gentle eyes, the times he placed his hand on my head and said that this girl must live strong. Back then I thought he loved me more than the other grandchildren. Now I understood it was the guilt of someone who knew my origin, but did not have the courage to speak. Leaving the cemetery, I did not go home but stopped at a small cafe on the corner where I used to study in college. I ordered a black coffee and opened the hospital records again, page by page. Every dry line of text became proof of a life that had been exchanged. I saw the name of the woman who gave birth to me and an old address in the suburbs, a place I had never paid attention to before. My heart beat faster when I looked at that address. As if another door in my life was opening, I wondered where that woman was now and whether she was still alive, and whether she had ever thought about the daughter she had been forced to leave behind. In that moment I understood that I could not return to being the same daughter in this family as before, because inside me a bigger question had appeared than all the others. Who am I, and where do I belong? I drove past the building where my brother worked, saw his car parked outside, and suddenly realized that he was still living in the truth I had just lost. He still believed he was the biological son of my mother and stepfather, still believed in a complete family that was actually built on an old secret, and I did not know if I had the right to break that. I remembered the fear in my mother's eyes when she asked if I would tell him, and for the first time I felt clearly torn between compassion and anger, because if I stayed silent I would continue living like a nameless shadow. But if I spoke out, this entire family could collapse. I realized that my decision from now on was no longer only about me but would affect everyone standing inside this family picture, and that was why I finally understood why my mother and my grandfather had chosen silence for so many years. Sitting alone in the cafe, I felt as if I were standing at a crossroads of my life. One road leading back to the old house with familiar meals but full of lies, another road leading to the stranger who had given birth to me but never raised me. I finished my cold coffee and told myself that I could not keep running away, that once the truth had opened, I had to follow it to the end, no matter how much it hurt. When I stepped outside, the midday sunlight shone straight into my eyes and made me squint. And in that moment, I knew that the journey to find my biological mother was not only to learn who she was, but to understand who I was after all these years of living in a family not born from the truth. I left the old house the next morning with a small suitcase and a sense of emptiness I had never felt in my life. The familiar road leading out of the neighborhood suddenly felt strangely long and silent. The rows of trees along the street looked like quiet witnesses, watching me leave without anyone stopping me, without a farewell, without a promise of return, only the sound of the suitcase wheels dragging across the dry road, echoing like the count of a life that had just closed. I did not cry, not because it did not hurt, but because the pain had passed the limit of tears. It lay still in my chest like a heavy stone, making every breath slower and deeper than usual. I temporarily rented a small room near the city center. The room was only big enough for a single bed, a wooden table, and a window looking out onto a narrow alley. But to me it felt wider than any space in the old house because here there were no scrutinizing eyes, no half-true, half-hidden words, no role of a daughter who had to pretend that everything was fine. During the first days there, I could hardly sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the kitchen where my mother confessed the truth. I saw my brother's face when he said he did not know who he should consider me to be. Those images repeated like a film with no stop button, making me understand that leaving the house did not make memories disappear but only gave me space to face them alone. I began to reorganize all the documents I had brought with me, the copy of my birth certificate, my grandfather's notebook, the small notes I had picked up from the hospital. I placed them on the table like pieces of a life that had been exchanged, and for the first time looked directly at the question I had avoided for days, who I truly was if I was no longer the daughter of that family. I took all the files to meet a familiar lawyer to ask about my legal rights. He looked at me for a long time before saying that on paper I was still a legal adopted child, and no one could take that away. But biologically, I had the right to search for information about the woman who gave birth to me if she was still alive, and that my grandfather's will, although it hurt me, did not violate the law. That answer did not give me a sense of justice, but only made me understand that the law could not fix the empty spaces in the human heart. I left the lawyer's office with a thicker file but a heavier mind, because I knew that from this moment on, searching for the woman who gave birth to me was no longer curiosity but had become a need for existence. As if without knowing who she was, I would live forever in an unfinished story. In the days that followed, I traced the old address in the birth record. The small roads led me to the outskirts of the city, where low houses stood close together as if trying to hold on to each other against the wind. And when I stood in front of a door with peeling paint, my heart beat so hard that I thought I would not be able to knock. I did not know what I expected behind that door, a hug, an apology, or just a face that looked like mine. But when the woman opened the door and looked at me with stunned eyes, I knew that this moment had been destined for a long time. I said my name and my date of birth. She stepped back as if she had just seen a memory she had buried deep. Then she invited me into the small living room with an old sofa and a dust-covered table, where there was no family photo hanging on the wall. She said she had thought I would never come, that she had signed the papers to give up her child when she was very young because she had no money and no relatives to rely on, and believed that the baby would have a better life if not with her. She did not know that any exchange or arrangement had happened in the hospital. To her, I was simply the child who had left forever. I listened to her story without feeling that I was meeting my biological mother. I only felt that I was touching a forgotten part of my own history. Between us, there were no shared memories, no years together to call family, only the bare truth that I was born from this woman but raised in the arms of another. She asked me if I was happy, and that question made me silent for a long time, because I did not know how to answer about a life that was both full and lacking. I said that I had a stable life, but I needed to know who I was in order to continue living without doubting myself. That meeting did not bring the feeling of reunion I had imagined. It only left a heavy silence. I understood that finding the person who gave birth to me did not mean finding a new family, and that the truth sometimes is only enough to close a question and not open a path to happiness. When I left that small house, it was already dark. The streetlights stretched across the ground like thin lines of light. I walked more slowly than usual, as if I did not want this moment to pass too quickly, because I knew I had just passed through an important door in my life. Returning to the rented room, I sat for a long time beside the suitcase that was not fully unpacked, thinking about New York, where I had built my career and my life, where no one knew my story, except what I chose to tell. And for the first time I realized that there I did not need to be anyone's daughter, did not need to carry an identity created from other people's fear. I only needed to be myself. The decision to return to New York came to me quietly but clearly, not to run away, but to begin again with an identity no longer based on lies. I booked a plane ticket for the next day and rearranged the papers in my bag, keeping the copy of my birth certificate and my grandfather's notebook as two pieces of a life that had been opened in a painful but honest way. On the flight leaving the city where I grew up, I looked down at the roads growing smaller and understood that family is not only the place we are born, but also the place we choose to belong, and from this moment on, I would choose my life based on truth, even if it did not bring easy peace. I did not know what the future would be like, but for the first time I felt that I was moving forward with my eyes open, instead of living in a story written for me since the day I was born, and in the silence of the airplane cabin, I understood that the journey to find my identity did not end with knowing who I was, but began with learning how to live with it with all the courage I had. I returned to New York on a cloudy morning. The familiar city appeared through the taxi window as both close and strange. The roads I had walked every day suddenly carried a different meaning, because this time I was not returning as a daughter in a family full of secrets, but as someone responsible for her own life. I opened the door of my small apartment and stood for a long time in the quiet space. There was no familiar voice, no smell of family meals, only the distant sound of the city coming from outside the window, and in that moment I realized that I had truly entered another stage of my life, where I had nowhere to hide except within myself. In the first days back at the hospital, I tried to keep my routine as before, but my mind was no longer the same. Every time I saw a patient lying in bed and family members standing beside them, I thought of the word family with a feeling both close and distant. I understood that there are people living in the truth who do not know how to value it, and there are people living in lies who do not have the courage to touch what needs to be said. I began to work more slowly, listen to patients more, and realized that I myself was also learning to listen to the empty spaces inside my heart, the spaces that I had once covered with work and responsibility. One evening after a late shift, I stayed in the break room with a close colleague and told her part of my story. Not to seek pity, but to prove to myself that what I had gone through was real. She was silent for a long time, and then said that perhaps the truth did not take away my family, but only revealed a family that had already been fragile. That sentence made me think all night because I knew it was true. I realized that for many years I had lived as a daughter, always trying to carry responsibility for a family that had never truly given me the right to know who I was, and now that the truth had been revealed, I no longer had to force myself to hold on to that image. On evenings alone in the apartment, I opened my grandfather's notebook and reread each line, no longer with resentment but with the calm of someone who understood that he too was only a person afraid of hurting others. I no longer blamed him for his silence, but only regretted that the silence had lasted too long and caused many people to live in the dark. I began to write my thoughts in a new notebook, not to retell the past, but to organize the present. Each page was a step in learning to accept that I was both an abandoned child and a woman raised in an imperfect family, and that both existed within me as inseparable parts. There were days when I felt lighter, and days when sadness returned like a silent wave. But I no longer tried to push it away, and instead learned to let it be there, and then pass. Once, while caring for an elderly patient who had no family beside him, I heard him say that what he regretted most was not poverty or illness, but not saying important things when he still could. That sentence was like a mirror reflecting my entire story, and made me understand that the truth, even when painful, is the only path to avoid living with regret. I began to think of my mother and my brother, not with anger as before, but with a necessary distance so that both sides could breathe. I understood that if I returned too soon, I would only be pulled back into a cycle of blame and defense. And if I stayed in New York, I could learn to stand firmly by my own name. I no longer asked which family I belonged to, but asked who I wanted to become, a woman living in the past or a woman who accepted it and moved forward. As the days passed, The emptiness in my heart was gradually filled with new habits. Morning runs along the Hudson River, dinners I cooked myself in the small kitchen, and short conversations with people who did not know my story but still saw me as a doctor and an ordinary person. I understood that life did not give me a new family right after taking away the old one, but it gave me the chance to build myself through honesty, and that was perhaps the greatest gift this painful journey had brought. Sometimes I still dreamed of the old house and the kitchen where my mother confessed the truth, but in that dream I no longer stood still and instead turned my back and walked out with a lighter feeling, as if my subconscious was also learning how to let go. I know that the hardest part is not finding the truth but living with it every day without letting it become an open wound. And that requires me to grow beyond who I used to be. When I look back at the journey from the envelope in the lawyer's office to the small apartment in New York, I understand that I traveled a very long way just to return to one simple thing, that I cannot choose where I was born, but I can choose how I live. And that choice is no longer based on fear but on clarity. I stand by the window, watching the traffic below, and feel a new calm forming inside me. Not complete happiness, but an acceptance deep enough for me to step into the final chapter of this story with a different state of mind. No longer running from the past, but also not letting it control my future. 1 year after the day I left the old house, I stand in front of the mirror on a spring morning and realize that my face has changed. Not because of time, but because my eyes are less afraid than before. I no longer search for the answer to who I belong to, but begin to accept that I belong to the life I am living. I receive a short letter from my mother. Not long, not explaining anything, only saying that she hopes I am well, and that if possible, I should let her know where I am in this life. I hold the letter for a long time and do not feel anger return like before, only a quiet feeling like looking at an old photograph. I understand that some distances are not meant to be erased, but to keep both sides from hurting each other again. I do not reply right away, but let the letter stay in the drawer for many days. Until one evening after a shift, I write a few lines saying that I am living well and learning how to be myself, without blame and without promises. Just a greeting from two people who were once very close but now need to stand on different sides in order to breathe. When I drop the envelope into the mailbox, I feel lighter inside, not because everything has been resolved, but because for the first time, I am not writing out of fear of losing my family, but out of honesty with my own feelings. I continue my work at the hospital, continue my morning runs along the river and my evenings rereading my grandfather's notebook, and I understand that he left me not only a secret but also a lesson that the truth always needs to be spoken no matter how late. I no longer see the past as a crack that must be hidden, but as a boundary line that helps me see the road ahead more clearly. Whenever I meet young patients standing in the middle of difficult choices, I see myself in their eyes and realize that all of us have a moment when we must face what cannot be avoided. There are nights when I sit alone in the small apartment and think of my story as a book that has reached near its final page, not a perfect ending but an ending enough for me to close it without regret. I understand that family is not only the place where we are born but also the place where we are allowed to live truthfully. And if that place no longer exists, then we must build a new space for ourselves with honesty and courage. I do not know what the future will be like, but I know that I will not return to being silent as before. I will speak when I need to speak, and leave when I need to leave, because silence is no longer a way to protect anyone, but only prolongs the pain. When I look back at the journey from the day the lawyer called me to the office until this moment, I realize that the most important thing is not the truth inside the envelope but the way I choose to live with it. I can let it destroy me, or use it to grow. And I have chosen the second path even though it is slow and painful. My story is not meant to accuse anyone, but to remind that every family has hidden corners and every person has the right to know who they are. If you are in a situation like mine, standing between silence and truth, remember that you are not alone, and you have the right to choose a life not based on lies. I close this story not with tears, but with a promise to myself that from now on I will live with my true name, my true past, and a future decided by myself. If you have read this far, thank you for listening to a journey that was not easy. And if this story makes you think about family, about truth, or about yourself, leave a comment to share your feelings, like if you find it meaningful, and do not forget to follow so we can continue together with other stories about choice, growth, and how people learn to step out of their own darkness.